Listening to a true crime podcast can be intense. How about taking it a step further? Immersing yourself in luxury and the real world of true crime. Next year, I'll be hosting a riverboat cruise down the Rhine, departing in Amsterdam. For additional information and to book your ticket, go to sailawaygrouptravel.com/truecrime before what I think is a once-in-a-lifetime experience sells out. You've got this high-paying job at Ford Motors. You're married, 2 kids, your wife is a school teacher. From the outside, it feels like you're living the American dream. And when you turn up missing one day, after telling nearly everyone you're moving out of state, the last thing anyone expects is that someone has made other, more deadly plans for you. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me for the first of a 2-part Crossing the Line special look into a controversial, high-profile murder case you won't believe. When Michigan native Nancy Onofrio meets 27-year-old Bob Seaman in 1972, Bob is a young, hotshot, up-and-coming engineer for Ford Motors. Nancy is 20 years old, a slim, beautiful brunette, smart, kind, quiet, and eager to carve out her place in the working world as the secretary for Bob's supervisor at Ford. The moment she lays eyes on Bob, Nancy feels she's found the love of her life. They chat a bit on that first day. They make plans to see each other soon. And you know what? A romance is born.
I loved him. I loved him. I loved him. He was charming. Bob had a good side. He could light up a room. And that's the Bob that I loved, and that's the Bob that I tried to focus on when things were ugly.
Bob has that suburban dad look to him. Short-cropped black hair, husky build, bit of a dad gut. And the intellect of a guy who is going places within the growing Detroit area auto industry. In fact, after some years at Ford, Bob takes on the role of vice president at local automotive manufacturer Borg Warner, making a hefty 6-figure income. Inside a year of them meeting, on May 26, 1973, Nancy and Bob are married and living outside of Detroit in Farmington Hills, Michigan, after a brief move to Indiana. Farmington Hills is the second largest community in Oakland County, Michigan, just a short drive, 25 to 30 minutes from Detroit. A claim to fame Farmington Hills maintains is that it often ranks as one of the safest cities in the United States. That being said, Larry Nassar is from Farmington Hills. If that name rings a bell, scumbag Larry Nassar was the team physician for the United States women's national gymnastics team, and he used that position to sexually assault hundreds of young athletes. Nancy grew up in Lincoln Park, Michigan, about a half-hour southeast of Farmington Hills. She excelled in her studies, earning valedictorian of her high school class. On paper, Nancy and Bob make the ultimate suburban power couple, destined to ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. Within 6 years of marrying Bob, in 1981, they welcome a son, Jeff, and then another son, Greg, 2 years later. The Seaman family, by all outward appearances, comes across happy and enjoying the fruits of life, and what seems to be a picture-perfect sitcom family is taking shape. As the kids grow and Bob rises up through the ranks of the auto industry, Nancy spends her time raising the kids and taking care of all the household chores, including the landscaping and various handyman projects around the house. She is happy to put off her career dreams for the sake of her family. Yet, as the kids make their way through school, by 1995, some 20 years into the marriage, Nancy decides to take off the stay-at-home mom cap and go out into the world and do what she's always wanted. Here she is describing that time frame.
After I got my degree, I did some substitute teaching for a while, almost 5 years. And then I was hired full-time at Farmington Public Schools, and it was like the dream that I had just dreamt my whole life.
She gets a job teaching 4th grade at Longacre Elementary in Farmington Hills. And she fits this mold of the doting teacher ideally. Her students adore Nancy, parents the same. She is kind and generous with her time, but perhaps even more important, she is able to reach kids in a way that only someone destined to teach can. There are cracks, though, within the walls of what seems to be an idyllic family structure. Major issues going on behind closed doors. Nancy relates a story from early in their lives that, in retrospect, she says should have been a red flag. She and Bob are driving home from Bob's brother's wedding. It's about a year into their marriage. Bob has been drinking, according to Nancy, and he's pretty damn shit-faced. He starts in with her. They argue. And then Bob starts to pound on Nancy before attempting to push her out of the moving vehicle. Nancy freezes in fear. This type of violence is something she had never experienced. She grew up in a loving, caring, affectionate home environment. She doesn't know what to do about it. Bob, up until then, had never acted this way. So she decides not to tell anyone. It's a one-off drunken incident. From that moment, the first year of the marriage, throughout the years that follow, Bob displays that same rage in sporadic episodes, she says. Not every day, not every week, but often enough for her to realize Bob has a problem. And she begins to fear him. As the years of the marriage tick by, Nancy notices more and more aggressiveness and anger from Bob. The number of times is now increasing. By the 2000s, Bob seems to be always upset over something she's done. He berates her, demeans her, calls Nancy names. He's becoming controlling and even more violent, now throwing things at her, grabbing and pushing her around. Here's Nancy describing some of it.
There were times when Bob's short fuse and his anger and his rage would erupt, but I could identify the triggers. And so I tried to avoid those situations. During that period of time, there was some abuse, but it was manageable and sporadic. Things changed. As long as I was a stay-at-home homemaker, then things were okay because Bob was very authoritarian and it had to be his way. He would always say, if you would just do what I say. So as long as I was a stay-at-home homemaker, that worked for him. He had a real problem with strong, independent women.
And I just want to point out here, objectively speaking, this is Nancy's version of the events. There's very little corroborating evidence to back it all up, which, it's important to say, doesn't mean none of it happened. And so, consistent with many women living in fear of an abuser, Nancy learns to cope and accept it, hoping it will someday change or even stop. She tells only a few people and plays it down when she does. She doesn't report Bob or even go to the hospital when she's injured. This, I might say, is the deception of the abuser. The part of this that is so very complicated. We know that many of the women stay frozen in this position out of the consequences involved with leaving. The stat that always bothers me is abused women don't actually leave the relationship for good until the 6th or 7th attempt. That is, if they are alive at that point to leave. In 1995, the Seaman family dynamic changes drastically. Bob loses his job. He's actually fired. By then, Nancy is excelling in her career as a school teacher, a job which will ultimately earn her several local and national awards.
Suddenly, the 6-figure income was gone, and I was the only income, the only health insurance. And throughout our whole marriage, Bob's goal was to be CEO of this corporation. And when he was fired, that disappeared, and suddenly my career was taking off, a career he never wanted me to have in the first place.
So there's this new domestic conflict now between them that, Nancy says, Bob could not handle. He had always been the breadwinner. And Bob is one of those old school, I'm the man, I take care of my family guys. And losing his job becomes a tremendous blow to his ego. And with the tables turned and Nancy now head of household, Bob becomes even more bitter, angry, and violent. From what Nancy claims, this shift in the marriage turns what were random explosions of rage into a fairly routine abuse regimen Bob relies on whenever he feels triggered. Then Bob decides he's going to start a business after considering all of the opportunities that might feed his desire to merge business with pleasure. He opens up a batting cage for kids called the Upper Deck. He has a new sense of purpose, and this gives the abusive aspect of the marriage, according to Nancy, a bit of a breather. But it doesn't last long. Through the Upper Deck, Bob meets a local couple from town, and both of the Seaman children later say that Bob became very close to the couple. He even hires the wife to help out around the Upper Deck office. This drives Nancy crazy. She and this woman are at odds all the time. They do not like each other. Then Nancy says the woman tells her that she is no longer welcome around the office. In fact, Nancy says she went into the office one day and someone had replaced all the photos of Nancy and Bob and the kids with photos of this woman and her kids. And it's around this time, Nancy says, when she realizes Bob and this woman are having an affair. Bob and Nancy argue about this constantly. One episode Nancy recalls takes place in June 2001, an incident that sends Nancy to the hospital.
When I went to the hospital that day, I had every intention this time, because that was the most serious injury that I had sustained up until that point. When I went to the hospital, I said, this is it, I'm telling. And I went into the triage room and I sat down in tears. And I looked out the door and there was a parent from Longacre, the elementary school where I teach, sitting in the visiting room. And I saw her looking at me and I couldn't do it, because if she heard what I said, then everybody would know at school, and I couldn't do that.
I had to wonder, why did it not occur to Nancy to head off to the police after leaving the ER? Maybe she is too traumatized at the time, or she decides afterward that reporting Bob now will just cause more pain than she can take.
He told me if I ever called the police, he would kill me.
You see, that right there, what she just said, is the dilemma a victim of domestic violence continually faces. A constant state of, what should I do? The fear and control the abuser wields over the victim dictates an inner dialogue. The abuser is always inside the head of his victim.
I believe it was 2002. It was a summer night on a weekend. It was late. It was like 11 o'clock at night. And we had had a fight, and I had bruising all over my arms. And I got in the car, and I drove to the Farmington Hills police station. And I went in, and I talked to the officer at the front desk. He said, you have two options. He said, I can sit you down with someone, and you can fill out a formal complaint. But your husband will be put in jail. Or you can take this pamphlet and go and apply for a personal protection order. And I stood there and I looked at him and I said, there's got to be something in between. I said, I can't put him in jail. I can't do that to my sons. I can't do that to my career. I said, I can't do that to Bob. I can't put him in jail. There's got to be another option. I worked so hard for my career. I couldn't have something like this come out, because parents would go to the principal and they'd say, my child might not be safe in Mrs. Seaman's room. What if her husband shows up at school? So that's why when I went to the Farmington Hills police, I couldn't let them put that in the paper. I couldn't let that come out. I couldn't let people know in the school community. I couldn't let my teacher friends know either. I was ashamed. I'm a 52-year-old woman. He beats me and he kicks me to the ground and spits on me. I can't let people know that.
This volatile Seaman marriage cannot go on forever like this. Something has to give. I have said numerous times, an abuser's behavior never de-escalates. It always escalates. The abuse, the control, the threats become worse and worse as time goes on. And here now, within the Seaman marriage at this time, a tossed chair or a shove or even a smack, in comparison, seems like child's play to what is about to happen. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. This is completely our show. Reviews and subscriptions really help. And without your help, I could not do this. And that support, I must tell you, means everything. It's incredibly humbling. We can grow the show together, which will allow me to do even bigger things with it. Remember, you can find new episodes dropping every Wednesday night. If you go to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com, you can contact me there to suggest cases or just say hello. And look for me across all social media platforms at M. William Phelps. That's the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. I need to take a break here. Be right back. When I was a kid, very young, I collected Matchbox and Hot Wheels cars. I loved them. I had a case for them in the shape of a tire. I hardly left the house without that case. Bob Seaman collected actual cars in the same way kids collect Hot Wheels. Among the many vehicles Bob had purchased over the years was a Ferrari and a classic Shelby, 2 cars worth a hell of a lot of money. He also had a 1989 Mustang, which Bob and his son Greg had been talking about restoring together. Jeff, the Seaman's other child, was married and living out of the house close by. The idea of restoring that Mustang becomes a father and son thing. Bonding. All that testosterone-fueled sporty fun between a boy and his dad working on a car together. But Bob and Greg have a falling out one day on Greg's birthday, and Bob tosses him out of the garage, tells him he needs to pack his shit and get the hell out of the house as well. The words Bob uses on that day are cutting, Nancy claims. Never come home again. This, mind you, on the kid's birthday, during a situation that was supposed to bring them closer together. Explosive, unpredictable. That is Bob Seaman, according to Nancy. But I'll say this, there can be no debate about this part of a case that, as you'll see moving forward, has a large amount of debate attached to it. What's more, Bob then takes the fight with his son even further, burying that wedge between him and the boy even deeper by giving the Mustang to that couple he had befriended, the one whose wife, Nancy believes, Bob is having an affair with. By 2004, Nancy has seen and been through enough. So she does something to her that is drastic. She needs to get out of this marriage and divorce Bob. Get away from the guy. All of this emotional and physical abuse needs to stop. So, in secret, Nancy starts shopping for a condominium. Puts a down payment on one she favors and sits her boys down and tells them about her plan. But your father can never find out, she tells them. They decide they will say the condo is for Greg, the boy Bob kicked out of the house. None of them know, however, at this same time, Bob has his own little secret, a plan to be done with Nancy and the boys for good, which he has himself been secretly scripting for quite some time and is about to, as Mother's Day weekend 2004 approaches, put into action. Bob is planning to move out of state. The way Nancy describes this important time frame, from the beginning of 2004 until May, her life was centered around trying to stay out of Bob's way, not be home when he is home. She sleeps upstairs. Bob generally sleeps in the basement or on the couch. Nancy gets up before him and goes to work so she doesn't have to deal with Bob's anger.
Getting up at 5 in the morning to go to an 8:20 job. I was at the door waiting for the custodian to let me in at 7 in the morning. Most of the battering was taking place before I went to school. Bob had a problem with me working. He had a problem with, it was a control issue. He was wanting to humiliate me. He had a low opinion of teachers. I would write him a letter or leave him a note. You can't punch a note. I never really gave up hope But I knew I had to get out, so probably in February when I put the deposit on the condo, I realized that I needed to leave and our relationship would probably end.
It's May 9th now, a Sunday. Mother's Day. Nancy, her son, and his wife returned to the house from being out together. They want to use one of Bob's vehicles, a large SUV, to help Greg move out of his dorm. Greg is graduating from college, so this plan about Greg moving into that condo fits together. Remember, as far as they know, Bob thinks this condo everyone has been talking about is for Greg. Bob says no to using his vehicle. Their son, Jeff, and his wife then leave after realizing that things are getting heated in the house and they don't want to be around for the blowout. Nancy says goodbye to her son and his wife. Then she has a conversation with Bob about the spring cleanup around the house. The yard work, which Nancy has always done, has been horribly neglected. Everything is growing over. This is a gated community. Nancy is concerned about this. She asks Bob to help her clean up the yard. Do it yourself, he tells her. Bob then heads down into the basement of the house and closes the door.
So I had to do it myself. So I went into the garage like I always did and gathered all my stuff together. My hedge trimmer, my extension cord. I went and got the gas can for the lawnmower, made sure we had enough gas in the can. I gathered everything and put it at the far end of the garage in front of the single bay door because that's the door that worked. I also opened up the drawer to the workbench and got out my hand pruners. There was an old hatchet in there that I had used the spring before, but it is 25 years old. It was dull the spring before. It managed to just pretty much mash the branches that I need. It wasn't a nice clean cut. We didn't have our bench grinder at home to sharpen it. Bob had taken that to the upper deck.
Whenever Nancy and Bob speak at this point, it's nothing but screaming, intense, bitter gripes on Bob's part. Bob, it's clear, has had enough. On that Mother's Day, May 9th, 2004, Nancy gathers all of her tools together. She puts them by the garage door so they'll be ready when she gets out of work the next afternoon and gets home. While she's doing this, she picks up a hatchet. She feels the edge of it. She realizes it's dull. The tip of it mushroomed over. So she heads out to Home Depot. It's near 7 p.m. She walks in, stands in front of the hatchets, and picks one. She brings it to the self-checkout. She pays, and she leaves. She drives back home.
I walked in the door. It was quiet in the house. Bob was downstairs. I went to the garage with the hatchet in the bag. I took it out of the bag, threw the hatchet on top of the generator where all of the rest of the lawn materials were gathered. I went in the kitchen, threw my keys on the counter, purse was on the table, took my tea, took the bag. I went up to my room and I closed the door. The house was quiet. I remember getting my clothes all laid out for the next day. I turned the TV on and went to bed.
The next morning, May 10th, Nancy gets up and gets ready to go to work. On most days, she'd be up at 5, out of the house by 6:30, avoiding Bob entirely. On this day, she sleeps late. Bob is already up.
Well, I had been getting up before Bob. That was my strategy for avoiding confrontation. So when I walked down the stairs and I walked down the hallway to the kitchen, I was a little startled when I saw him sitting there because I had been purposely getting up so very early to avoid seeing him. When I walked down the hallway, my heart started racing and I was concerned because I had been avoiding seeing him in the morning because mornings had become very ugly, very ugly. And I was also concerned because he had just returned from Arizona visiting a brother that totally despises me, and I knew I had to be the conversation that whole week. I'm walking down the hallway, and Bob is facing me. He's not drinking tea. He's not watching TV like we always did at that time in the morning, or he would do as well. Right, the TV is on the kitchen counter. There's no tea in front of him, no coffee, nothing. Well, he's sitting with his hands folded, facing the hallway that I'm walking down. No, when I saw him, like I said, I just took a deep breath. It's like, oh God, no, I can't do 15 rounds this morning. And I walked into the kitchen and I didn't say a thing. I pretended he wasn't there. I went into the kitchen and I started getting ready for work because I always take my lunch. I got the sub bun out. So I laid the sub bun in a dish on the counter, get the knife, about 8 inches long, thin, all silver. Even the handle, it wasn't wooden, it was just all silver. So I walked to the counter, and he still hasn't said anything, I haven't said anything. There's no eye contact being made. I slice open the sub bun the rest of the way, lay the knife down on the counter, walk over to the refrigerator, take out the ham, the cheese, the lettuce, start assembling the sandwich. Still no words are spoken. I walk over to the opposite side of the room again, where the refrigerator is, because I keep the saran wrap in a drawer over there. I walked over there to take out the saran wrap, and then he spoke. He said, I think it's time we talk about going our separate ways. When he said that, I said, Bob, I can't have this discussion in the morning. I said, we've talked about this before. I can't go to work all upset. I said, I can't do 15 rounds with you. I said, what time are you coming home tonight? He said, I want to settle it now. And always in the past, I would try to say, oh, let's get counseling. Let's try to work it out. Let's stay together till Greg gets out of school. This time I didn't. I said, I'm so ready for this. Let's just do it. I said, I've already made plans. I said, I'm moving on. And that's when things got heated.
This is something Nancy has never said to Bob before. She'd always tried to curry favor and say, we'll work through things. But on this day, Nancy says, okay, I am moving on. This is not what Bob wanted to hear, apparently.
He said, you know, good bitch, you think I don't know that condo's for you? The whole purpose of keeping the secret about the condo was I knew he'd kill me. He said he'd kill me, threw me up against the refrigerator by my throat and said he was going to kill me. You know, good bitch, how could you do that? What are you buying a condo for? You know, good fucking bitch, how could you do this? I lied to him about the condo. Worse than that, because now he knows the boys have deceived him as well. I'm just standing there. My eyes, from so many confrontations before, I knew to look around the room for my things because I know I got to run.
Bob is now yelling and screaming. He realizes that he had been deceived about the condo, and this enrages him. Nancy begins looking for her keys so she can leave.
He's sitting there, but by this time he has picked up the knife that I was using to cut this up on. Because Bob used to play with silverware when he was talking. It was a nervous thing. Sometimes he'd pound the counter. I'm looking for my keys, I'm looking for my purse, I'm getting out of the kitchen. I reach over to get my coffee mug. He had the knife in his hand, and he just pointed at me like you're making a point. You bitch. And he just dragged it across my hand as I'm reaching for him because he's sitting on that side. I just was stunned. I said, oh my God, you cut me. And I wiped it on my pants. I had black slacks on. And I just stood there for a minute looking at him like in disbelief because nothing like that's ever happened before. I mean, there's never been a knife. There's never been.
This is the first time that a weapon has been introduced into their fighting. Nancy is terrified. According to her, she believes Bob is truly going to kill her this time, not just threaten.
Well, I'm really scared now because he's angry on a lot of different levels about a lot of different things. We'd had fights before, but it was always about one incident, one thing. But this was like the grand finale of fights. It was the condo. It was the boys. I was a thief because how did I pay for the condo? It was too many things happening.
I'll get to what happens next after one final break. So Bob has that knife Nancy left on the counter after making her lunch. She can see her car keys. All she has to do is grab the keys and make a dash for the door, get the hell out of there. She makes it to her keys, picks them up, but doesn't have time to take her purse or anything else she needs except for a book bag. Then she runs for the door. When she gets there, Nancy is once again stunned. The door is deadbolted, and the handle to unlock the deadbolt is gone. She then runs down a short hallway nearby that leads to the garage. She opens the door to head into the garage. Once inside, she can pop the garage door open and leave that way. But as she is making her way between the house and the garage, Bob comes up from behind her and pushes her. Nancy stumbles to the floor. As she does that, she knocks over a cart with all of her gardening tools on it. She is on the floor now, thinking about how she will stand back up. Near her is a generator, on top of which she had placed the new hatchet she bought the previous night. And this is where the situation turns from pushing and shoving, shouting and threats, into an incredibly violent encounter. I think it's safe to say that when a volatile marriage, undoubtedly broken and abusive, reaches the point where one spouse picks up a knife and begins to taunt and threaten his partner, who is running for her life, this situation is not going to end well. We've all heard this story before. I have this running joke on Crossing the Line that, turn on Dateline every Friday night and here's the story, spousal murder. The question in this case will become, who is telling the truth and what actually happens after Nancy finds herself on the floor of that garage with her husband coming up from behind with a knife in his hand?
Okay, I'm on the floor by the generator, curled up. I'm covering my head and my face. My legs are pulled up. And he comes out toward where I'm sitting, where I'm laying over there at the generator. I'm covering my face because I don't want to be bruised for the graduation. Then he came over and he grabbed my arm. I'm on the ground, but he's got my arm, he's squeezing it, and he said, "What is it you don't understand, bitch? I don't love you anymore." He's angry. He's angry because he said he's wasted his life with me. He says, "Why can't you just die? I don't love you anymore." I couldn't see anything because my face I'm not looking at Bob. I'm all covered over. He's still yelling at me. And he starts pacing like he always started pacing. I mean, he's still yelling at me. He's yelling at me about everything, about the boys. His relationship with Greg is fractured. That was my fault. He said, "I told you, you're never going to take Jeff away from me." And now that Jeff had helped conceal the condo, he thought I was taking Jeff away from him. He was furious. He was just furious.
Bob had crossed a threshold, Nancy believes. She has never seen him this angry. He's screaming, breathing heavily. She starts begging him to allow her to get up and leave.
He's angrier. He says, "You're never going to live to move into that condo. You're not going to live to move into that condo."
Bob begins pacing and kicking things around the garage. At one point, Nancy then hears him walk slowly toward her. She can't see much because her face and her head are blocked by her arms, in fear of being hit in the face by Bob. On top of the generator to Bob's left is that brand new hatchet. Nancy realizes she needs to get up off the floor if she has any chance. Bob grabs her by the leg and continues screaming at her, spittle flying out of his mouth. She believes that her life is in danger. Bob has never sounded this enraged before. Nancy reaches up and grabs hold of the handle on the generator near her so she can pull herself up off the ground and onto her feet. Feeling around, trying to gain some leverage, she touches the handle of that new hatchet she'd placed there the night before. Bob is close enough to it himself to reach out and grab it. Remember, before this violent part of the fight began, Bob had been leaning over Nancy saying this:
"Before I let a no-good fucking bitch like you have half of everything, I'll see you dead. I'll see you dead."
And it's what happens next that changes their lives forever, making this one of the most controversial spousal murder cases of the past 20 years, which I'll unpack for you in the second installment of this two-part Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps special. Remember, I need your help. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget, leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts, and set your schedule. You can find new episodes dropping every Wednesday night and log on to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com to contact me and suggest cases, or just say hi. And look for me across all social media platforms using the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. Thank you for supporting this show. I am allowed to do it because of you, and that truly means more to me than I can say. And remember, be safe, be aware, and don't forget to listen to my other podcast, Paper Ghosts, wherever you get your favorite shows. Sources for this episode include Domestic Violence, PTSD, and Trauma Evaluation Report on behalf of Nancy Seaman by Holly Rosen, August 6th, 2021. People of the State of Michigan versus Nancy Seaman, Court of Appeals, February 13th, 2007. Court transcripts, Michigan versus Seaman trial, 2004. CTL is produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, written and executive produced by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.